5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Hello everybody, it's Sylvie. Welcome back to the TBR Diaries. I hope you're doing good. Today's video is actually going to be a wrap-up for all my reading from the month of October. I've said before that I don't like wrap-ups, that filming wrap-ups stresses me out. It's a lot of books to talk about and a lot of thoughts to translate into words, and that is all still true, but I scrapped the last vlog of October because it was just not good. And I've just decided to do a wrap-up. On that note, I'm not going to be doing vlogs in November because I'll be reading non-fiction and I just feel like they'll be really crap vlogs, so there's going to be a bit of a break from the vlogging, as much as I love to do them, and then hopefully I will come back to vlogs in December or a little bit later on. But for today's video, as I say, it is a wrap-up. I read 10 books in October, which I feel like is pretty damn good because I've only read a total of 46 books so far this year, so I'm hoping we can keep that energy up for the end of the year. But I read 10 books. They were all good because, as you may know if you've been watching my vlogs, I'm very pro DNF at the moment. I'm just very easy to drop books that I'm not really into when I'm reading them at the minute, and that has definitely been good for my reading, so I enjoyed all of these and I'm going to get straight into it. The first book that I finished in the month of October is Nona the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir, possibly my most anticipated release of this entire year. If you know me, if you've been on my channel for more than about 17 seconds, you know that I am fully obsessed with this book series. Very few things in life have the same grip on me and my psyche as this book series does. I am highly, highly anticipating the fourth book and final book in this series coming out next year, but for the time being, let's talk about Nona. This is actually a really hard book to talk about because it's the third in the series and I don't want to give you any spoilers. This is a series that I think it is really beneficial to not know a single thing, not have a single spoiler. Personally, I'm pretty ambivalent about whether or not I am spoiled for a book. It doesn't usually bother me, but as for this series, I think you really are best going in blind, which does mean you're going to be extremely confused, but I think that is the joy of this series. That's kind of the point of this series, and if that's not your thing, you're probably not going to get on with it, so it is what it is. This was just a beautiful, beautiful book. It was just as heartbreaking as previous installments in this series have been, but heartbreaking in a slightly different way, heartbreaking in a way that I was almost happy to have my heart broken in the way that it happened in this book. I really enjoyed seeing characters pop up from previous books in this slightly different context, seeing them through slightly different eyes. On that note, actually, each book in this series so far has been from the perspective, from the primary viewpoint of a different character. This character, of course, or this book being Nona. And we don't really know who Nona is at the start of this book. We know who she might be, and we're trying to figure out, and the other characters in this book are trying to figure out exactly who Nona is. I can't say any more than that, but this was a beautiful installment in this series. If you have not yet read it, and if you're reading this series, I highly, highly urge you to do so. Of course, this is possibly my favourite series of all time. That's a bold claim. I very much love this series though, and I urge you to pick it up if it is something that you think you're interested in, but do bear with it because it is a bit confusing and a bit... If you're used to knowing what's going on in books, you might struggle, but personally I think the struggle is worth it. The second book I'm going to talk about is The Hollow Places by Kingfisher. This is a horror book, but it is not, in my opinion, and I'm quite easily scared, this is not a super intense horror. It is more kind of creepy, spooky, very atmospheric. In this book we follow Cara, who is very recently divorced. She goes to stay with her uncle to help him run his museum of curiosities, and while she is helping her uncle, she comes across a hole in the wall behind one of the exhibits, goes through that hole, and finds herself in a very strange place that is very clearly not of this earth. She investigates this place with the help of her neighbour/friend, whose name continues to escape me, and they realise that it is some kind of place with doorways or portals to alternative or parallel worlds, and that it seems like everybody who has been there ends up dead in some horrifying reality bending way. Like I say, I really enjoyed this book. It wasn't too scary, but I was thoroughly creeped out at points. I also really enjoyed the sense of humour that ran through this book. I think that helped it to not be too scary because it kind of grounded it a little bit. I listened to audiobook for this, and that was not too scary an audiobook either. I really enjoyed this book. I'm definitely going to look into reading more of T. Kingfisher's work in the future, and I'm very glad that I read it. I also read Yellow Jessamine by Starling. This was a short, spooky, gothic, creepy little read, which I thoroughly enjoyed. This is the second Starling that I've read, and I'm just loving her work. In this book, we follow Evelyn Perdanu, who controls the city of Delphinium with trade and with secrets. One day, a mysterious sickness comes to Delphinium on one of her ships, it seems, and she is trying to keep herself safe, trying to escape the dying city of Delphinium while also keeping her dark and mysterious past and secrets safe as well. A lot of the intrigue in this book comes from like plants and poisons that Evelyn is dealing with in different ways throughout the book, and this did have like a supernatural element to it. It is like a fantastical gothic kind of a book, and I really enjoyed how it was done. I thought the ending was really good in this as well. It kind of gave you enough to feel satisfied, but also leaving things open enough that it was quite like creepy. Right at the beginning of the year, I said I was going to read the first Law trilogy this year, and in October I finally read the first book. I don't know if I'll get it finished. In fact, that whole video, we could just pretend it never existed because that TBR is not being completed. But I did read The Blade Itself in October by Abercrombie, and I really enjoyed this. This was what I consider to be like classic fantasy. It's like European medieval white man fantasy, which is not the be all and end all by any means. It's what I kind of grew up knowing as fantasy, so I like to return to a fantasy like that every now and again, and I thought this was a really good one. This is my first foray into grimdark fantasy, first foray in recent years anyway, and I know that Abercrombie is kind of or considered to be like the father of grimdark fantasy, so it was nice to read his take on the subgenre. This was more of a political fantasy than like a super magical fantasy, and it was actually reasonably slow paced in this first book. I think that might change in the second and third books in the series. There was a lot of introduction to the world and to the different characters, which I quite like a slow book. I like a lot of world building. That doesn't, bother me at all. And I did feel like we got a really good grasp on the different characters and the different perspectives in this book. And I think that's really going to be beneficial when I go into book 2, which I anticipate might be a little bit more actiony, more fast-paced, potentially. But I did feel like we got a really solid introduction. As for the grimdarkness, it was pretty much exactly what I expected. It also had quite a dark sense of humour, which I also enjoyed. And I am looking forward to continuing with this series. I'm going to try and finish it this year because I want to know what happens. And you know what I'm like, I do tend to forget things, especially in a more political based story, which this definitely was. Okay, I did have a post-it note, but I will put the cover up on the screen. I read Square by Square or Square Cubed or Square Cube, I'm not sure, but I read Square by Mira Grant. I've definitely spoken about Mira Grant before. I love her books. Mira Grant is the pen name for Shauna Maguire, and she writes horror under that pen name. This was a novella, so it was quite a quick read for me, and this is a contemporary world in which one day the laws of physics completely break themselves and rifts appear all across the globe, and through those rifts these big Godzilla-like aliens step out. The aliens promptly kill each other. The main kind of crux of this story is that where these rifts have appeared, on one side life continues as normal, the world is pretty much as normal, but on the other side of the rift the world is like a desolate, freaky wasteland where you can't enter because you'll get ripped to shreds, and the laws of physics are definitely not behaving as they should. And everybody who was on the other side of those rifts is presumed dead because nobody can cross that boundary. Our main character starts this book when the rifts appear. I think she's like 14, and she loses her sister, who's a couple of years older than her, on the other side of the rift, and so she gets into physics, becomes a physicist to try and figure out what the hell happened and figure out if she can cross that boundary to try and find her sister. As you might expect, the various governments and militaries in the world are trying to find out if there's a way to utilise the rifts or any of the after effects of these rifts in defence. And then there are some other effects that I won't spoil for you here, but they're definitely impact the story. As with the other novellas that I've read by Mira, even though they're really short, she packs a lot of world building in. One of my favourite things about Mira books is that the science that she puts into her worlds are very like well fleshed out, like it feels very realistic. I am definitely a more like sciencey, literal, factual person. That's how I like to understand things. So I just really love seeing such a well developed like fake science in her books. So she's good at the world building. She gives you enough information that you feel very inserted into the story, but the way that she writes these stories and the way that she wraps them up at the end in particular, you definitely get some satisfaction of the plot points that you've been following, but there's a definite sense that this is just a chapter inside like a larger world, which I really enjoy. It's open-ended enough that I feel like there's definitely more going on, but it's focused in a way that is satisfying to read. Next up is one of my new favourite books of all time. This is A Taste of Gold and Iron by Alexandra and Rowland. I'm going to keep it brief because I'm actually planning on doing a full review video of this just because I loved it so much and I want to talk about it more. But to be brief, this is a adult low fantasy romance. We're following a prince who has just been involved in a diplomatic incident and is now trying to prove his loyalty to his sister and his bodyguard who has been assigned to him following said incident. And this book is really focused on their relationship. It is a romance, so the romance aspect is very heavy, but what I really enjoyed about this book was that it focuses on their like courtly relationship just as much, and that is just as important. I mean, for the first half of the book, it's more important than the romance because it's a very slow burn romance, but just looking at the way that they were already devoted to each other's like position, and then as their personal feelings grow, how that like changes the relationship and how they navigate that change. There is a little bit of like a political intrigue. In order to prove his loyalty, the prince is trying to uncover or find out who is at the root of a conspiracy to do with their coinage, because he and some other people in this world, the kind of magic element is that they can touch, taste metals, so they can touch a metal and figure out what the composition is. And as a result of this, their kingdom's coinage has always been very strong and a like marker of their reputation as a kingdom. And so when this issue with the coinage crops up, it's very serious, and he kind of takes it on to prove his loyalty to the kingdom, to his sister, who is the Sultan. That's a relevant detail that I have not yet mentioned. Everything is woven together beautifully. The focus is on the relationship, but I really love the world building. The political intrigue, mystery side of things was interesting enough and detailed enough that I was satisfied with it. And overall, I really, really loved and adored this book. I've tabbed it, which is not something I've done with a book in a while, but I have like a whole colour-coded system going on for each of the characters, for some like world building stuff, and also there was a sense of humour in this book that I really enjoyed, and alongside the prince and bodyguard romantic relationship, there's also a lot of other relationships that are given some time and attention in this book, which I just really loved. Okay, I'm going to talk about these two together because they are books 1 and 2 in a series, and this is The First Sister and the Second Rebel by Linden A. Lewis. These are the first 2 books in a trilogy. The third book is out very, very soon, and I will be reading it because I need to know what happens. So The First Sister was a reread for me. So this is a sci-fi, political sci-fi space opera. Is it a space opera if it takes place like on planets? I'm not sure. You can decide that for yourself, but this is very focused on like rebellion and loyalty to different people and different ideals and how those things change. I really struggle to explain these books despite having just read them and spoken about them both in reading blogs. But I think because this is quite like a political sci-fi and there's a lot of like plot twists and people not being quite who we think they are at the start of the book, and so I'm treading quite carefully so as not to reveal anything that might be a spoiler. What I will say is this book is very fast-paced, very, very exciting. This book a little bit slower and therefore by default a little bit less exciting. Also, like, this book's quite a lot chunkier. And we're basically following 2 characters in this first book. We're following 2 perspectives. They're on opposite sides, and they just get mixed up in it and have, you know, their opinions changed, their ideas changed as this book goes on. This book, we're following the same people plus another couple of people, which is where it got a little bit slower feeling for me, because it felt like everybody was a bit too far apart. But in the last sort of third of this book, it really came together. It got really, really exciting, and I am desperate for the third and final book to see how everything wraps up. And pretty much thematically very similar. We're just being introduced to sort of more of the world and how things are actually much more complex than this book made them seem, as you'd expect from a series. One thing I will say is the first sister, the title character from this book, who is present in both, I am not entirely convinced by her character, and I'm not sure how that's going to be explored in book 3. I'm really looking forward to seeing how she, like, where her journey takes her in the third book, because we start the book knowing that she is presenting herself very differently to how she feels inside, because that is sort of her job. I'm just not sure. She takes quite a turn. She takes a hell of a turn at the end of this book, and then she takes another turn at the end of this second book, and I'm looking forward to seeing if we get like the real her revealed to us in the third book. But I will save my speculation. I feel like I've done a really bad job of explaining these books, but I really don't want to spoil anything, so go watch my reading vlogs if you want more thoughts. My penultimate book is another post-it note. I listened to the audiobook for Her Majesty's Royal Coven by Juno Dawson, which was a fantastic audiobook, by the way. It's narrated by Nicola Coughlan of Derry Girls and Bridgerton fame, and she does a fantastic job, so I would highly recommend the audiobook. Now, this book I have some complicated feelings about. It's all personal. The book itself I would highly recommend, and I loved the book, and then I had a personal issue with one of the choices that was made at the end. This is a contemporary book. It's set in the UK, and in this version of reality, it's not known to the public at large, but people can develop magical powers, and they are witches or warlocks. And at the very start of this book, we meet a group of teenage girls who are about to be initiated into the Coven, and then we speed ahead in time and we're following them as adults when they've sort of drifted apart a little bit and they have their various witchy lives. There has been a war in the recent past they have, I think, all fought in and are feeling very emotionally scarred from, and at the start of this book it is revealed that a new threat is emerging. Quite a large portion of this book is dealing with how trans people are treated. So in this world it's quite like a binary system of witches who are women who are more powerful typically than warlocks who are the men, and we meet a young teenage witch who is a trans witch, and we look at how various people respond to that in different ways. This shouldn't come as a surprise because Juno Dawson is trans, and I think especially with the other popular, you know, wizards in the UK series, J.K. Rowling has obviously done a lot of harm to the trans community, so it's probably not surprising that this book is addressing harm done to the trans community, and a lot of the rhetoric is directly lifted from what we see all the time levelled at trans people. Like I say, I really enjoyed this book. I thought the plot was interesting, it was fast-paced, I loved how the characters were developed, and I really loved seeing how these adults who were friends as teens, who were like really close as teens but are not as close now, sort of how they're interacting as adults, because that's kind of where I'm at in life a little bit, so I just liked seeing that. The issues that were tackled, like I say, the trans issues and also like white feminism, I thought that was integrated really well into the story, but also I thought was just addressed effectively as well. And then the very end of this book happened. The very final chapter just did things that really pissed me off personally that I don't like in books. So firstly, the very final chapter introduced a new problem that's obviously going to be a big problem for the next book in the series, which was kind of out of nowhere plot twist cliffhanger, which I don't love as like a narrative device, but you know, it happens, it is what it is. But the thing that happened is going to present I don't want to spoil anything because it's literally the very final chapter of the book, but the issue that is being presented is that of like an identity swap, somebody having to pretend that they're somebody other than who they are, which I really hate that in books. It is like my least favorite thing to read. It just really stresses me out because the whole time I'm following this character, like I know that they're pretending to be somebody that they're not, and that eventually it's gonna be revealed and it's gonna be bad and stressful, and it just gives me so much anxiety to read these plot lines. And then additionally, the very final thing that this character did, like the final paragraph of the book, felt to me like such a slap in the face to this character's journey throughout the book, and the like growth that they'd had throughout the book, and like where we ended. And then this thing happened and it kind of ruined it for me. Like, I just felt like it ruined, it's like, for what did we go through all that growth for if now you're going to do this? But anyway, like I say, those are my personal issues with the book. It's not a flaw of the book, it's just like it's a compatibility issue. So I'm going to wait and see what the reviews are like for the sequel to see like exactly how that plays out, because obviously things might not be exactly as they seem because it was the very final thing that happened. But I'm a little bit gutted because I really, really enjoyed this book, and I was like, yes, absolutely gonna buy the sequel. And then that happened and I was like, oh, maybe not. I'm done ranting about like my very minor personal issues that I have with this book. But like I say, I want to really stress, it was a really good book. I would highly recommend it. And finally, the final book that I read in October was The Jasmine Throne by Tasha Suri, and I really, really loved this. I spoke about this in the vlog, and then the vlog is not making it to the internet, so I kind of forget what I haven't said. But this is the first book in a trilogy. This is an adult fantasy series. The Jasmine Throne was one of the Sapphic trifecta of 2021. The Sapphic is here, but it's quite like minimal. It's not like a romance book at all. But it's good. What we get is good. This is a fantasy in which we follow Melini, who is a princess who is being imprisoned by her brother, the Emperor, for reasons that are not revealed at the beginning of this book, so I won't tell you. Our other main perspective character is Priya, who is a maidservant but also used to be involved with and kind of is a priestess of this plant magic that we see throughout this book, that is something that the Emperor is trying to stamp out, or has stamped out. You know, it's fuzzy. Priya and Melini team up because Melini wants to escape and Priya wants freedom for her people as in the place that she lives, but also her people as in the plant magic people, kind of. This is quite political, there's quite a lot going on. This is another book about like rebellion and people trying to take back power for themselves, and I really, really enjoyed this. This was just such like a magical book, which sounds really stupid because it's a fantasy. And I mean that in the sense that, like, yes, the magic elements in this book were quite at the forefront. They were very important. We spent quite a lot of time talking about the magic in this book, but also the writing was very lush and beautiful without being like too flowery and like overly descriptive. It was still really beautiful writing. And it just felt very magical. Not in like a whimsical way, like it was pretty dark at times and like pretty heavy stuff was happening. But it just, I don't know what else to say. It just felt very magical. I was very satisfied with where we left things at the end of this book, and I'm very much looking forward to the sequel. And we did see in this book both characters are a little bit morally grey. The princess is trying to take back her own sort of power and autonomy and agency, and she is also trying to leave us some power over the kingdom that her brother rules over because she does not agree with him. And then our priestess is trying to, like I say, take back power for her people and have some freedom to live as they want to without being subjugated to the Emperor's rule. And yeah, this was just a thoroughly enjoyable read. I've had this sitting on my shelf for like a year and a half now, and I've only just got around to it, and I sort of regret that, but it does mean that I've already got the sequel, and I feel like the third book is out in the first half of next year, so maybe I did time things quite well after all. So that is everything that I read in the month of October. I did not mention at the beginning of this video, but I was taking part in Gothtober, and I fulfilled all but one of the prompts. I think the one prompt that I didn't read a book for was the disability rep prompt, for which I was going to read Monstrous, which is only a graphic novel and would have taken me about an hour, but I just didn't feel like it at any point in the month. So I did not quite hit all the prompts for Gothtober, but I hit all but one. I had a really good reading month. Highly recommend DNFing anything you're not enjoying. Funnily enough, it means that you enjoy the books that you're reading. Who knew? But yeah, let me know if you've read any of these, if I've inspired you to read any of them. I hope you've enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one. bye.